Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this open forum on shaping Africa's digital future and looking at that future through data governance. We have a fantastic panel, so I'm going to start. We've lost a little bit of time, so I'm going to quickly introduce this panel. Firstly, we have Honorable Salima Ba from Sierra Leone, and we're really pleased to have her. She's the Sierra Leonean Minister of Communications, Technology and Information. Here on the other side of the panel, we have His Excellency Ambassador Bitange Ndemo, past collaborator, and in fact something they didn't put in your bio is that you once hosted the IGF in Nairobi in 2011. Currently, Bitange is the ambassador of Kenya to the European Union, so he's based in Brussels. And right here on my right is Priya Chetty, the incoming Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, which I think is Africa's foremost think tank, and I think in general, producer of data evidence and analysis in policy and digital development in Africa. And then on my left here, I have Wakabi. Wakabi is from CEPESA, the Center for Collaborative Internet Policy in Eastern South Africa, and also, I think, a veteran of internet governance. And I think one of the organizations that has done just such an immense job in building the capacity of civil society in Africa in trying to be active or being active voices in policy. And then on the far left, we have Kojo Waji, who is Vice President, Public Policy for Africa from Meta. And I think, Kojo, this is your second IGF? Third?
No, this is my 19th IGF.
Your ninth?
19th.
19.
Yeah, I feel like I've participated.
Were you in the youth caucus at the first one?
No, I am a 70s baby.
Well, welcome. It's really good to have all of you here. And my name's Anriette Esterhuizen. I am the organizer of the African School on Internet Governance. I'm a past chair of the UN IGF MAG and associated with the Association for Progressive Communications. I think just really thanks to the organizers for this session, because data governance, I think, is indeed really one of those important cross-cutting topics that we need to engage at the IGF, and it's particularly important at the moment for Africa, looking at where Africa is in its journey on digital transformation. There's a rollout of digital IDs, national data exchanges, AI strategies, and cross-border trade initiatives. For example, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And all of these efforts hold promise for Africa's development and for increased digital equality in Africa. But behind every digital system and innovation lies a very important critical foundation. In fact, I think two critical foundations. Firstly, data governance, effective, accountable, inclusive, development-oriented data governance, but then also digital inequality, which is the context that still tends to undermine the implementation of so many innovative and forward-looking digital transformation strategies on the continent. But data governance is not just about regulation. I think it's about systems, coordination, and institutions that ensure that data is managed in ways that are secure, transparent, and trusted. And I think, just adding this is particularly relevant to the IGF, trusted across stakeholder groups and by different types of actors, trusted by private sector operators, by privacy advocates, by trade justice advocates, by governments, and by the technical community as well. And it's only really when you have this trust that digital transformation can be implemented, but work and achieve benefits for people. For governments, there really is a challenge at this point in terms of how quickly to move from policy to practice, how to build systems that are technically sound, and I think also systems that are future-proof, but at the same time systems that recognize and that the realities of the context that those governments are trying to work in are still so characterized, so deeply characterized by digital exclusion at multiple levels, at the level of institutional capacity, people's access, the capacity to have the devices and the skills that are needed to really participate and benefit from these systems. So this session is trying to bring together these quite diverse, different stakeholders to talk about this. They're all involved in this in one way or another. And so they're here to share their insights on what the challenges are, what the possible solutions are, what we've learned from the data governance implementation and framework development that's taken place so far. And to start us, I'm going to ask Minister Salima Ba from Sierra Leone to just give us a sense in terms of what Sierra Leone has done and the experience that you've gained, over the last few years. What do you think? What are the critical, the factors, the variables that really makes that difference between not effectively implemented policy and strategy, or incoherent or non-harmonized policy and strategy, to policy and strategy that actually makes that leap from theory, from ideas, from strategy to practice to implementation?
Yep. Thank you so much for organizing this, and definitely to the organizers at GIZ and everybody else who's participated. I think, as you said, this is such a really critical conversation to have, specifically when we look at Africa's digital transformation journey and agenda, and how data is the essential part of that. I think I was having a conversation with somebody. I was like, it went from something that was an afterthought, I think, for a lot of African governments, to now I think being just a central piece to what we're trying to do. And I think, well, one, specifically, we understand when we talk about our digital transformation agenda, how issues such as data sovereignty and how our data is managed and what that looks like, I think, now the understanding of how critical that is, I think it's even more established. But then also, I think the other reality is the economic value when it comes to data as well. I think that is also a part of it, that everybody's getting to the understanding of there's a huge economic value, and we want to ensure that how that is exploited or how that is managed or leveraged or tapped into, we want to be part of those conversations as well. But definitely key points in terms of how do you move from policy and strategy to practice. I think one of the first for Sierra Leone, what has really worked, because this has been a journey that we've been on for maybe over 20, 25 years, but really we've only started seeing effective outputs from that, I think, for the past 6, 7 years. And I think it's been as a result of really strategic prioritization. So, for example, from the very top level, by His Excellency the President, we get to see that political buy-in and interest. For example, when the President came in for the very first time, he appointed a Chief Innovation Officer. He established a dedicated agency that focuses on technology and how do we implement. He's included it in making technology a big five, one of his big 5 game changers in the National Development Plan. He's established a dedicated ministry. So that's been really key, because most of the time, in terms of how government works, really political buy-in is really like half of the battle already won. So, and even like 2 weeks ago, we had an annual conference, and His Excellency the President had like a fireside chat where he really got to speak to the public about this vision and his plans for it. So I think that's been key. I think the other part as well, which I kind of touched on earlier, was setting up dedicated institutions, I think, is really important, because we could have policies, we could have strategies, but if you don't have the institutional frameworks to actually implement and carry them through, I think you'll be in significant problems. So really, this has been key for us, setting up these dedicated institutions that have really been at the center of implementing a large part of this agenda, I think has been key. We're even now at this point also very soon looking to establish another agencies like the e-government regulatory agency that would really enforce issues around data governance. And I think
Perhaps just tell us, when you say the relevant institutions, what are the institutions that you've established that you feel are playing such a vital role?
Absolutely. So, for example, the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation was established in 2019, soon after the government came into force. This has been a key institution for us in terms of really implementing and developing digital government solutions and moving forward that way. We've established the National Cybersecurity Center. We've established a Universal Access Development Fund that's been critical in really driving access in unserved and underserved areas. Now they've established a dedicated ministry. So really, we see that as being one step being taken forward. But then also maybe the final piece we believe of this, I think what I like to call my twin pieces, is around one, education. I think, well, especially we talk about data governance and within our environment, sometimes there's this feeling of wanting to hoard data, people wanting to micromanage data, people not wanting to share data. So really for us, what has been key is education in terms of making public institutions and workers understand the value when we really get to use data and do the value add of data. But also getting them to issues around capacity building, ensuring that people actually have the capacity and to implement the areas of focus. But maybe the other part of it is also enforcement mechanisms. Because sometimes I think we understand in our region that people don't want to do it for two reasons. Either there is a fear of this new way of doing things, this new idea that now I'm meant to actually share my data with another institution. So why am I doing that? I don't want to. So we get to educate them and drive that way. But also sometimes it's just unwillingness to do it because of people fear transparency and accountability, and they don't want that either. So we look at both sides and we make sure we have enforcement mechanisms that would address either scenario. So I call it my carrot and stick, where we reward those who follow the guidelines, and then we look at ways of punishing those who refuse for one way or the other. So it's been a definite carrot and stick method for us.
Thanks very much for that. I think what really strikes me from that institutional ecosystem you described, that many of those institutions are not dealing with data governance in a narrow way. In fact, you've described an institutional context which covers institutions that deal with access and inequality to education, which I think is a very creative. It's that kind of whole of government approach that we hear a lot about and very rarely see. Bitange, I want to ask you, I mean, you've been a champion of the multi-stakeholder approach when you were in government and I think also in your role in regulation in the ministry and now in your role as ambassador. How do you feel Africa can leverage the partnerships that operate in a space like the IGF and in the data space to accelerate our digital agenda? You know, how can we take advantage of best practices, but still stay in the driver's seat, as in the sense of not just copying blueprints that are coming from elsewhere, but actually appropriating, developing, redesigning, or even designing from scratch and innovating approaches that can meet our needs. So how are we doing? But I also want you to comment a little bit, are we doing it? Are we succeeding?
Okay. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for the question. Thank GIZ for making this arrangement. I have been looking backwards to see what we would have done best to benefit Africa in this space. And I sort of regret in the sense that had we, at the beginning, started to think system-wide, thinking of everything, that everything you do has an impact, and this is how we go forward. For example, we talked about infrastructure. We started implementing cables and other stuff. And of course, in Kenya, we did some sensitization training, people, digital training, digital villages, to be able to take advantage of the infrastructure. What we had forgotten to do is that we should have immediately begun to teach people what data can do with respect to poverty reduction. If we went to the villages and says, this infrastructure can help you to improve your productivity, in the sense that you know the amount of fertilizer you need when you need to grow this, the weather patterns and stuff. So we did everything in a serial format instead of system-wide. We're doing this because of this. So everybody was doing because everybody was doing it. Now we look back and say we should have done more to use systems theory and think much more broadly to change things. Nonetheless, we need, as Minister said, look at sovereignty, especially Africa lacks data centers. When you're talking about sovereignty, it's got a lot to do with the kind of infrastructure we have in place. The regulatory mechanisms, in some places, people confuse regulation with stifling innovation. You don't do this, you don't do that. We need to create regulations that would enable innovation to take place, and that's how we can benefit from this. And then we need to collaborate more with like-minded moving forward. With these few things that I've mentioned here, plus digital literacy, we can begin to maximize the use of this technology and also manage our data in a better way that can move us forward.
Thanks a lot for that, Bitanga. I now want to turn to you, Wakabi, and SAPESA has done such pioneering work in terms of digital rights and the protection of privacy, and recognizing how that and data protection is an enabler of other rights. I mean, for you, what does meaningful rights-based data governance look like in practice at this point in time? And I think particularly now that we're no longer just talking about GDPR or privacy, data governance is now so much more than the protection of personal information. The data ecosystem involves so many different types of data. So how do you feel we can effectively apply this rights-based approach to this evolving landscape of data governance?
Thanks, Henriette. So, yeah, from the outset, as you mentioned, data and the right to privacy have become really central to our lives and our participation in society. So if the right is not promoted, if then the appetite for citizens to partake of public services, for them to participate in public affairs, etc., will all be undermined. So how then do we have rights-based approaches? One of them is that whichever data policy frameworks we make, and those that are related to data protection, we should ensure that they uphold the rights to privacy and related rights like access to information and protection from surveillance. On the other hand, we should ensure that our laws aligned with the high-level instruments such as the Africa Charter on Human and People's Rights, which govern a lot of rights around the continent, as well as with constitutional guarantees in the individual countries. But Dr. Ndemo has also mentioned the issue of balancing protection with the innovation. We, as much as want to protect rights, we should also enable access to data that enables us to make value out of it. For instance, public access to data in the public interest. A lot of the times, many of our laws contain principles of data protection, which we keep singing about. But when you look at if you were to do a sort of assessment, many of those in reality are not upheld. As civil society, it becomes our role to do assessments of countries to see whether they are actually living up to those principles or they are not. The other element I would like to speak to is that of independent arbiters and remedial mechanisms. And the minister from Sierra Leone actually spoke about them. The need to establish independent, well-staffed, well-funded institutions like data protection authorities that have the power to mediate, to issue guidance, to issue penalties. That, again, is an area in which we are going to be able to have rights respected. A final one is clearly acknowledging and instituting measures to ensure that data rights of minorities and marginalized groups are clearly upheld, which brings in the concept of data justice, namely that data should not be collected, should not be used in any way that undermines the rights of marginalized groups. As I sum up, what are some of the elements that need to be done to ensure that citizens' voices are heard? One of them is clearly having meaningful spaces for participation. A lot of the time, there are no meaningful spaces for citizens to be able to express their views and for those views to be taken into practice. But there is also the area of privacy and data rights are fairly new rights. Not many people know their data rights or how to express them. So creating awareness of the rights, creating awareness of how to protect yourself in digital environment and in policy making are areas also that can go somewhere in this regard.
Yes, I was actually going to ask you if you think people know what data rights are, or and if the concept of data justice is one that is well understood. And I think it is challenging, particularly because data rights also spans different types of data. But absolutely, that's exactly the role that civil society should be doing. Kojo, let me move to you. As Meta has to operate in this space, how do you, from your experience of a company that operates in multiple jurisdictions, a very powerful company, a company that's a very data-intensive, data is so central to your business model, how do you find the policy and regulatory environment in Africa from the perspective of complexity, suitability, harmonization, compliance, and accountability and transparency on your part?
Yeah. Great question, big question as well. The first thing I'll say is a huge thanks to the government of Norway for putting this conference on, having spent so much time at a number of them, most recently Japan and Saudi and others. I know what a big undertaking it is, but also a huge thanks to my fellow panelists. I told Dr. Ndemo unashamedly that he mentored me from afar. Certainly with my time with the Alliance for Affordable Internet and still with the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, etc. And some of the changes he made to the policy environment in Kenya were groundbreaking in terms of how they accelerated access to the mobile, etc. And Wakabi and Priya, who I worked with, Alison and many others. And I told the minister that I've worked in Sierra Leone for a while. So huge respect for the panelists. In terms of the policy and regulatory environment in Africa itself, and most of my work across Africa, Middle East and Turkey is with Sub-Saharan Africa, although I do look after North Africa as well, but I'll probably focus on Sub-Saharan. I see a lot of development. We have 13 national laws that speak to this. Some of the most well-known are obviously Papaya in South Africa, Nigeria's Data Protection Act, Kenya's Data Protection Act as well, which highlight how thoughtful governments are being about this particular issue. Part of your question, Arianette, spoke to the level of harmonization we see and the impact it has on companies like ours. And I will say, smaller companies, if you want to describe it that way, who seek not only to operate in their national jurisdictions, but also access African markets abroad. And I'm not going to go on about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the promise that it holds. What I'm probably seeing less of is harmonization between those national policies. Yes, there are similarities, but I think if you think about companies that are seeking, both big and small, that are seeking to take advantage of a 1 billion person opportunity on the continent itself, 1.3 billion if you want to look at North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and growing and getting younger, some level of harmonization is needed. I think the AU data policy framework offers a huge opportunity, not only for governments to continue creating legislation that speaks to their national priorities, whatever those may be, but also creates opportunities to harmonize those frameworks and let organizations, whether they be purely private sector or public sector or NGO, CSO organizations work across, have some certainty and predictability about how data can flow across the continent and travel. I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments on some of the great interventions from colleagues. My learned colleague from Sierra Leone, whom I've just met and has already impressed me with her policy stance, spoke about the creation of institutions. You asked, Arianette, I just want to link this to the question, you asked about how companies operate in that thing. I will say, I would love to know more about the kind of institutions being made. Because in our experience, sometimes we're, when Kojo is asked to have a call with country X, I'm speaking to this head of an organization that's just been created. I'm speaking to the current DG of the regulator who has been there for some time, and the organization's been there for some time. I'm speaking to the digital development organization as well, all who understandably believe they have jurisdiction over this growing and important area. And sometimes, not in Sierra Leone, but in some countries, you get a complexity that creates challenges between the institutions themselves and the individual players, as well as for companies both large and small as well. So I do think that people should think carefully about that. I thought Dr. Ndemo's intervention about the lessons learned from the past with regard to what we told people about the value of data is really instructive, not only for how we go on thinking about data governance now and in the near future, but also how we think about AI. Walk around this conference, AI is the big topical subject. And I think we do need to think about, right, what are we telling users, the beneficiaries, the recipients of this great promise that AI has? What are we telling them about AI now? Are we telling them that it's a huge opportunity that they can feed into, that governments can feed into, that commercial companies can feed into to help improve their lives, as Dr. Ndemo said we could have done in the past? Or are we suggesting that big companies like Meta, like Google, like Microsoft, or governments with nefarious purpose, who have nefarious intent or purposes, are going to use AI to, whatever the nefarious purposes may be? And I do think the communication about the promise of AI, the benefits, as well as the risks, need to be really, really thoughtfully approached and delivered to people who will benefit most from it. I hope that answers your question a bit.
No, you absolutely did. Thanks very much for that, Kojo. And I just want to emphasize, Kojo talked about the African Union Data Policy Framework. For those of you that are not from Africa, I really urge you to have a look at it. In fact, there are people around this table who helped develop it, and GIZ played a very supportive role. But it's an African instrument that has been adopted by African states. And it's a framework that I think very effectively balances the protection of data with the use of data, the making availability, the sharing of data for economic and social and public interest benefits. So, and then there's another African instrument. I'm going to let you speak, don't worry. I know you. There's something that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, a resolution that was passed last year. This is an African body. It develops soft norms, but they're very powerful norms, and they passed a resolution on access to data. And the role that data plays and access to data in realizing the right to access to information. And again, a very powerful, forward-looking, human rights-oriented instrument, but again, looks at the use, the protection, the sharing of data. Kojo, you wanted to have a quick
I want to be
report.
super quick, Ariana.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the additional time. The one other thing I would say about the framework is I believe, as a historian of African history, and I've spoken about my respect for the panelists, but my heroes include Kwame Nkrumah and many of the kind of post-imperialist or decolonization heroes of our time. I think the framework also offers an opportunity for us to create a harmonized policy framework that is bespoke for Africa. And I say bespoke for Africa because I know data is a global thing, but fits not only our national need, but also our continental need and helps us assume that position. I quickly did a search on Mario Draghi's report, which I've read in full, but I asked Meta AI. You can also use ChatGPT if you want, but I asked Meta AI.
Or DeepSeek.
Or DeepSeek, whatever you like. I used Meta AI to ask me what were the main findings of the Mario Draghi report. The Mario Draghi report. And the Mario Draghi report says that, I won't read it all, but the key thing is Europe has fallen behind its other regions. Lack of investment, a small number of big tech players, no big tech players, I'll say diplomatically, less diplomatically, many other issues that have happened because of this, in short, over-regulation.
Okay, let's get back to...
There's a pushback because
I'm going to push back too.
Yeah, you can, because there is.
We're not going to talk about European regulation.
No, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm talking about the lessons learned from that and the lessons we can take as a continent from that. And for those of you who are interested, go and read the report. It's not me saying it. It's one of Europe's foremost politicians who has said that lessons could be learned, and I would encourage our continent and others to learn from that.
I'm teasing Kojo, but because he's from Meta, and I think Meta deserves...
I'm from Ghana.
But that's true. No, but I think your point about the data policy framework, I think in the context of data flows that are still very extractive, you're absolutely correct. So about the power of the data policy framework. Priya, in Research ICT Africa's experience, you've been working with governments in implementing and domesticating the principles in the African Union data policy framework. Can you also work with data and evidence-based policy as a tool? What do you see as the most common critical gaps in implementation? What are governments really struggling with? Is there a multi-stakeholder dimension to this that we might not have touched on enough? So what do you think are the issues that we really need to focus on if we want to utilize the power of data in a rights-oriented and development-oriented way?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and speak on this panel. I love coming in at this point because I think that people have raised different gaps and challenges already. And this correlates very much with what we are seeing in our work. And in our work, we work at the national level, we work at the institutional level, we work at the regional level, and more recently, we have worked as a knowledge partner to the G20 as well. And in our work at the moment, data governance has evolved from a standalone concept to how it's integrated into concepts such as DPI, the extent to which it can be used as a tool for AI transparency and accountability. And more recently, we've become a little bit obsessed with the data value chain and participation and agency and inclusion for all of society, including micro, small enterprises as well, in having access to some of those data benefits. So people have spoken about the different gaps and challenges in terms of the fragmented legislation, not necessarily speaking to each other. And this is a global phenomenon as well. It's a very dynamic field, and definitions of data are changing by the day, in fact, and we cannot resolve on a single definition. And even when we speak about the data value chain, it's so dynamic, it's moving very, very fast. And in fact, it's in some ways unfair to ask the policy to keep up with the pace of innovation. People have spoken about the enforcement mechanisms and weaknesses in the enforcement mechanisms and the regulatory oversight models that we have, and that coherence and alignment in what we speak about now as a data ecosystem, where we realize everyone's got a role to play, the different government departments. We heard how science, tech, and innovation are coming in. We know about how statistics are being called upon to play a role. So that coherence in the data ecosystem as well. And someone raised political will, and as being one of the, and we've all had experiences with that. Investment and money and being resourced is the one challenge in order to make these kinds of institutional shifts and capacitate the different institutions. But on the other hand, you have to have a real political will and commitment to seeing it through. And of course, we remain with these very structural inequalities. So when we speak as the Global South, when we speak from a continental perspective, we entrench that we need meaningful inclusion. And that means that we also need data literacy and digital skills that enable us to participate in the opportunities that we are speaking about. The work that we have been doing is then in that evolution of the data governance framework. So what do we want to see from a regulation perspective, institutional perspective? And I don't want to box us into an African perspective because, as Henriette mentioned, we have a world-class African Union data policy framework. And it is being consulted on as a novel approach to data governance across the world. And because it introduces novel principles on how we can bring more equity and agency for everyone in the benefits of the data economy. But what are the things we are looking for as we make these shifts? For those who work with us, our partners, we always speak about our situational analysis where we want to understand the political economy and the kind of infrastructure setup and where do we stand before we work on data governance. We also look at the rights framework. So we want to know if there's the right to privacy, right to access information. We also want to know if there's something that can be interpreted as the right to meaningful connectivity or the rights to benefit from the data value chain. We try to improve on the adequacy of the privacy frameworks and the access to information frameworks. And more recently, we've been placing emphasis on the access to information frameworks. How do we manipulate the proactive disclosures and mandatory disclosures in this, so that we start to open up the data and have it available to those that need to use it. We also want to try and improve the adequacy of the enforcement mechanisms by going and having a look at the mandate of the institutions and of the regulators. If we look at the consumer protection regulators, the information regulators, if we look at the ministries, if we look at and even the institutional mandates to carry out standards building, are the mandates sufficient to really give legitimacy to what they are going to input into the ecosystem? So there's also no point in developing any of these if it doesn't have legitimacy coming from the institutional mandates. So there's often a need to change the mandates and to expand those. But what I wanted to place focus here that we haven't spoken about is to bring the civil society perspective in, which is that in all the work that we are doing, are we really putting emphasis on the user? And whether we're speaking about DPI, whether we're speaking about AI, whether we're speaking about data governance that informs those, are we putting the emphasis on the user? Have we considered their demands? Have we considered their inequalities, their baseline of where they're coming from? And can we look at these different mechanisms, the laws, and the policies and the institutional frameworks, and can we use that as a means of coalescing to build the user's capacity to participate and draw value? And that, I think, is the most fascinating part of our work at the moment is how do we build sustainable mechanisms for that data inclusion. It's something personally that we're very
And do you
excited
feel it's something we're not doing enough
we're not
of
doing
right now?
and we're not doing it. And if I even think about conversations we're having here, I would challenge us to say, are we putting enough emphasis on that?
Thanks. I know the panel want to respond, but we only have 10 minutes left. So before you respond, are there any questions online, Joshua? Are there any questions in the room? If you want to ask a question, go and stand by a microphone. Nothing online. Perfect. Please, you have to be super, super brief. Your name and your question. And make it a question, please. It's active. You can just speak.
Okay, so mine is comment related to the Kojo's submission. So currently, the African Union Commission, ISD division to be precise, is working with African countries to implement the African Union Data Policy Framework, for which GIZ is supporting. And the aim is harmonization. But there are 54 or some say 55 countries on the continent. And so we should accept that this is not going to be a very easy task. So the harmonization issue is on the agenda, but this is just a call for action for Kojo and other big tech organizations. What we have realized so far in implementing the African Union Data Policy Framework is that usually, and I know it's difficult, but big tech in the country processes usually tend to shy away, and they are more interested in platforms like this. And I think where we need to do a bit of work is in the country processes so that
level.
they support with the policy development and the development of the data ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks, and sorry to cut you short, but we have 7 minutes left. Please, quickly, and then we'll take that last point.
Thank you to the panel, and thank you to the moderator for mentioning the African Commission on Human and People's Rights Resolution 620. Please take a look at it. Resolution 620, African Commission on Human and People's Rights. My name is Guy Berger. I'm convener of the African Alliance for Access to Data that are working with the African Commission to develop guidelines on access to data following Resolution 620. So if you're interested in the Alliance and the work and shaping these guidelines on access to data, public sector data and private sector data, please visit dataalliance.africa. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Guy. Please be quick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Osei Keja from Ghana. My question is, many African nations do have data protection laws and largely modeled after the GDPR, yet enforcement capacity has been notoriously weak. What critical strategies or mechanisms can be put in place to make enforcement work? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And the last question.
Hiya, I'm Amy from Nigeria, and my question is, how can we learn from the successes and mistakes from other nations who are currently trying to improve data governance so that we can actually make some successful data governance changes within Africa ourselves?
Thanks very much for that. And Kojo, that's exactly the opening you were looking for earlier. So panel, we've got 1 minute each left. I think I'd like to bring in, Kojo mentioned earlier AI. I think I'd like you to respond. Think about the questions. Think about what you don't want to see as we continue on this journey and what you do want to see. And I am going to start over here with Patange, and then we'll move all the way to and we're going to finish with the Minister.
Thank you. I'll be very clear. What I want to see is to abandon the African Union Data Protection Law, and each country.
You mean the Malabo?
Yes, and if you recall, before we developed this, we had open government partnership which had actually dealt with a lot of issues around management of resources, and transparency. Once we begin to show what data can do, then we can put data regulations in place. Now we have put data regulation before we even know what data will do to the people. And at the African level, it's not doing anything. Nobody is implementing it, can't be implemented. It's just something we keep on waving around that we have.
Thanks, Bitange. Priya.
Yeah. In my closing, I'll respond quickly to some of the comments as well, which is the first is that we do have to continue the support for developing data governance frameworks at the national level, and including in the detail of how institutions evolve. The second is I love the civil society coalition with the African Alliance Coalition, because we must develop these standards with from that perspective, with those needs in mind, and this complements what could be done at the government levels and at the regional levels. And the third is to respond to the regulatory oversight mechanisms that, one, we can strengthen our complaint, practically our complaint mechanisms that we have at the regulators. And secondly, we've got a lot of traction with regulatory cooperation. So looking at how competition regulators interact with information regulators. And so you're closing the loop on different gaps and where some of the challenges might be. So that's my closing shots and a quick response.
Thank you, Priya. Wakabi.
Thank you. We are working with GIZ to help the East African community come up with a law, a harmonized law on data governance. We've been doing a lot of trainings, etc. And we think that this working at the level of regional economic communities can be one way in which countries can domesticate the African Union data policy framework. There are a lot of problems, different maturity levels, different laws, but harmonization we think can happen, especially in areas where there is already an economic community, so it can deepen free flow of individuals, of goods, and the integration. Finally, we need investments in order to make data make sense and make money, but same with AI. Data capacity is something we've talked about. The continent has less than 1% of the global data center capacity. We are not going to be able to do much, yet it has 18% of the population. We are not going to be able to do much unless we are investing in this capacity and the individual skills to make sense out of this data through maybe AI funds, through data innovation funds. It's upon governments and private actors to take that step.
Thanks a lot, Wakabi. 1 minute, Kojo.
Quickly responding, closing and quickly responding to comments. Kuku, I think we've met here. Nice to meet you here. Call to action. I would hope we're already doing that. I think Meta has one of the larger policy teams, certainly in Africa. Each of the members, I'm proud to say, was born of the region or whose parents were born of the region and come from various backgrounds, government, private sector, civil society. And I think a lot of call for actions, when we receive them, we are responding to. We want to be involved for Meta's benefit and the benefit of the continent and the benefit of users. We want to be involved in contributing to policy and regulatory development. So we're happy to work on this particular process as well, especially if it lends itself to harmonization. On Osei's comment, my friend Osei just gave a comment about enforcement. He asked, how do we enforce better, in short? I think enforcement should take into consideration the aims and what you're trying to do to improve data governance on behalf of users, as it always should. I think in my personal experience, that should be the primary reason for enforcement. And we should be thinking less about revenue generation, which is the case that some governments, and there's some excellent governments who aren't thinking about that at all, but some governments are thinking about it as in part revenue generation. And I think we need to be careful of that. And the last thing I'll say is on learning from others. The lady asked the question, learning from others. Let's learn from others. I've encouraged people to read the Mario Draghi report, which talks of fragmented regulation and over-regulation and the consequences of that. I would encourage us to be even more confident in ourselves about developing policy and regulation. Arianette has spoken to how the world is now looking at the AU data policy framework, and I would encourage us to do that. and talk to each other is my last point. I know DPAs, regulators across the region talk to each other, but talk more broadly as well. Talk to India, to Brazil, to other places as well to think about how they're doing it and seek to talk to us as part of a call for action, because I think tech wants to be involved. Sorry to take so long, Arian.
Thanks a lot, Kojo. Salima.
Yes, thank you very much. I really, as a response, I think the question asked from the participants from Ghana, I think that's such a critical conversation, and I'll show you at the very highest level within government, across governments. That's one thing we're discussing to see how do we really better enforce. I like what you mentioned about Priya and what you mentioned about maybe each country needs to look at what they need in terms of our data protections. Sometimes the harmonization doesn't really get into effect. I do think the conversation about enforcement could be a separate panel on its own. And I think it's a separate panel with private sector parts of that. I know you mentioned some governments, it's an issue of the revenue, but really, maybe some, but I'll assure you a large part of it is sometimes an issue of it doesn't seem as if I can bring them to the table any other way, especially when you're dealing with countries of a smaller economic size, and when they go up against big tech, sometimes there's that gap in me getting what I want. So maybe I'm going to go the most draconian I can. So I think this is where big tech really needs to come to the table to see how do we do. That's why you see actually a lot of the movement going towards the GDPR, because it seems as if it's the best example of continent outside of the Americas who's been able to get effective hold of how this is managed. So maybe I think that's a separate panel of itself, because you can dive into causations and how and different models and how we get there. But I do think for the continent's sake, as a closing, I think for the continent's sake, for the private sector's sake, and for the citizens' sake, I think this is a really critical conversation that needs to happen as soon as possible.
Thanks very much. We're out of time, but I don't think I need to make closing remarks either. So thanks for this, this fantastic panel. Thanks to the team that organized it. And I think to everyone, I really, I work in data governance in many parts of the world. I think Africa is the place to follow. Join us, invest in our journey, partner in our journey. And thank you so much for coming to the session.
Thank you.
Thanks to the online participants. I know you didn't speak, but we saw you. So you were visible. You were in the room with us. Thank you.